This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today to have a couple of guests, one coming from all the way from Israel, working out the time differences here to have a conversation with us. And that first guest is Dr. Daniel Bar-Tal, and he is a Branco Weiss Professor of Research in Child Development and Education at the School of Education at Tel Aviv University. His research interest is in political and social psychology, studying socio-psychological foundations of intractable conflicts and peace building, as well as development of political understanding among children and peace education. He's worked on a number of books which caught my eye, which is why we're having this conversation today, one of which is Intractable Conflicts, Socio-Psychological Foundations of Dynamics, as well as The Role of Trust in Conflict Resolution, the Israeli-Palestinian Case, and Beyond. Dr. Bar-Tal, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's my honor.
It's great to have you here. And we also have another conversation partner, a gentleman that I am privileged to work with at the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. That's Dr. Charles Randall Paul. He's the founder and director of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, where I'm privileged to sit as a board member and work on the Evangelical Chapter. Randy does a lot of things: research, writing, speaking. He is the author of a book, Converting the Saints, a Study of Religious Rivalry in America. Randy, welcome back to the program.
It's a delight to be with you.
Well, should I call you Dr. Bar-Tal or Daniel? What do you prefer?
Danny, if you want the Israeli way,
then
call me by the first name, Danny.
Danny.
Yeah.
Okay, I will try. I'll try to remember that.
Danny.
But okay. I was raised to be very respectful, and when someone's got a PhD, it may be difficult for me. So we'll try. Okay. Can you begin by talking about how you got involved in the academic study of intractable conflict and peacemaking? What brought you into that?
Okay, in fact, I got my PhD in 1975 in United States, and had 74 I got. Stayed 1 year in postdoc, and was really trained as a typical experimental social psychologist, but with one difference. I participated in University of Pittsburgh in a specific program that is really relatively unusual, as Rand really alluded to some extent, because it was interdisciplinary program that the university organized, and the focus was on education at large. So I came out of my studying as a social educational psychologist, and I began, and therefore I really landed in School of Education. But very quickly, I realized as a participant, active participant in the conflict, because I served in the army, I participated in wars, I was officer, I am, because it goes with you as a reserve, and coming from a political family where political issues were discussed, so I thought I cannot continue in educational social psychology. I want to shift into really studying conflict. And I did it in 1980. So, it's 40 years ago. I moved while being in Vanderbilt, really visiting professor. It was a kind of opportunity. I started looking at certain issues that I saw in a society that participates or takes part in a conflict that is very difficult to resolve. So this was the beginning.
Fascinating. I found social psychology fascinating. I did two grants. One was 3 years and the other was 2 years. And we looked at social psychology as to why evangelical Christians in America tend to have negative emotional responses to other religions, and that contributes to conflict. So this background of yours in social psychology, I find very fascinating and helpful. Randy, would you share a little bit about your background in how you apply social psychology to peacemaking and religious diplomacy?
Yes, I
Very
think
different. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
No. Yeah, okay. Rand, go on.
all right, Danny, I'll let you in if you want to talk.
No. It was a complete misunderstanding.
I think I was raised in New Jersey, in the East Coast of the United States, in a very mixed bag of religions and cultures. And my family was English, kind of stiff upper lip, keep the emotions inside. And when I went to college, I started studying psychology. And at the end of my my term in I think it was my junior year, I got involved in social psychology and group therapy sessions. And back in the 60s, for a person who had emotions on the inside, I was completely moved. It was a life-changing experience for me to study group process, where people exposed their motives, their fears, their experiences together in a group, in a small group. It had to be a small group. And I realized that influenced me deeply in my life as I saw people take risks and in trust in a small group that changed their attitudes about each other without necessarily changing the opinions of each other. They had different feelings and attitudes of trust, even though they didn't agree. And that was a fundamental realization in my life that later on, I went into business for many years and then went back midlife to get a degree at the University of Chicago to study intractable, but I like to call it unresolvable, which is different than intractable. Intractable conflict can be resolved. As Danny Bar-Tal has told us in his book, it's very difficult, but it can come to some resolved conclusion. Unresolvable conflict, by definition, cannot be resolved. It is a conflict that by its very nature has to, one party or the other has to convert to see the world in a different way, which is not a resolution of the conflict. It just, the two teams are no longer two teams. They become one team, right? And I was very interested in the pluralizing world that we're in, where it's very unlikely that everyone's going to convert to one worldview. Everyone's going to convert to one religion. And so it's not only intractable, it's unresolvable in its current state. No matter how much we reframe the issue, I like to say, when you get into deep conversations with people, you really come to understand and trust each other. You then know why you should be opponents. There are issues that if you're honest and authentic, you should be rivals over what the truth is, what reality is. And I like to, as John and I talk about, we talk about trustworthy rivalry, where you sustain a relationship that is close to friendship, but maintains the rivalry. And that became, for me, a political model, as well as an economic model, as well as an interreligious model of new possibilities. And I'm intrigued with Danny Bar-Tal's work of education and how you educate people to see as possible and even desirable to have trustworthy opponents or trustworthy rivals in their lives, in their societies. And I think this is the great vision of change that we have, is not to resolve conflicts, but to find ways for people to see conflict as part of their religion and to shift from anger and fear to appreciation and at the same time, true engagement of persuasion, where you're trying to change each other's points of view. So that's my background, and I'm really happy to have this conversation.
Danny, what kinds of research projects and examples have you looked at specifically and drilled down into in terms of intractable conflicts?
It's interesting. I will talk about it, but it will be an interesting discussion also with Ran, because I have a difficulty to accept that conflicts are by nature unresolvable, because when you look around, what did happen, conflicts that you wouldn't believe that will be resolved, not only, but the participants believe that it is unresolved, eventually it is resolved. If we take Northern Ireland, Basque country, Algeria together with France, we take Southern African conflict, Salvadorian conflict, Guatemalan conflict, eventually were resolved. So the question is really, what is the difference between the ones that are resolved and ones that are not resolved? And especially that we know also that some of the unresolved were very close to be resolved, like the conflict between Turks and Kurds almost was resolved, and for some reason, or the conflict in Cyprus. And our conflict, Israeli-Palestinian, was almost resolved, and eventually it escalated. So the question is why some were resolved and some were not resolved, and therefore I prefer not to put in such a strong way a term unresolved, because they can be resolved. And here I would like also to relate to what you said, because I also, and I believe that this is my contribution to political social psychology, you called it in centered way religion, but before you talked about ideology. I prefer the word ideology or religion as kind of, because it is religion, I am used to say that in order to change the view of what we call hawkish Israeli or Jew, to change his or her view about the conflict, it is as difficult as coming to, let's say, ultra-Orthodox Jew, you know what I'm talking about,
Sure.
And telling him one day, I have news for you, and you have to change your view. There is no God. Will you succeed? No. So it is very difficult, and we can obviously extend why and what is so difficult. So we just identified the term ideology, religion. I talk about ethos, I talk about culture, and here is the point. You, exactly as in religion, become, I don't want to use the word, but indoctrinated. Is it nice? Okay, will you accept it? Into particular view of seeing a conflict. And it begins very early. And again, my unique contribution is that I went to children 4 or 5 years old and investigated to see how do they view the rival and how do they view the ethos, the religion. And what I identified that already in the very early age, Jewish kids in Israel get this vision and they believe in it, absolutely believe in, let's say, goals of justifying the conflict, dehumanization of the Palestinians, viewing themselves in a glorifying terms, believing that they are the sole conflict victims of the conflict, etc., etc. And it's extremely difficult to change when it's not only schools, but you have really messages by leaders, mass media, ceremonies, the whole culture that supports this type, accepting your view, religion. It becomes a religion in a certain way. So this is at the moment a situation in Israel in 2021 where about 60-70% of the Israeli Jews really believe exactly in this framework that I just introduced. But in 90s was a very different situation. Many of us believed that we are marching towards resolution of the conflict. In 93, 94, this was a line. And then, you have to analyze what did happen that we changed the route and moved into escalation of the conflict. And I studied why did it happen? Why did it succeed? In a very recent book that was published in Hebrew for the Israeli audience. And this is a story that we are at the moment in a very different place from where we were in 90s.
This is a great story that you've just told us of how over a period of 30 years, significant changes can occur, which disproves my thesis that there are unresolvable conflicts. And I understand that. And so let me just say this. I came at this view from the standpoint of reading mythic and religious texts that create the backstory for the ethos of a culture. And these texts, although we know as scholars, they can be reinterpreted. In many cultures, they are not to be interpreted. They come as if they're self-interpreted. They come as if they're the story of the truth with a big T, right? And those are the stories that create the attitudes and expectations about conflict in this world. To be blunt, if God can create a flood to genocide the entire earth, or if God can tell Joshua to go in and wipe out the men, women, and children and the animals. Every religion has a story about conflict between good and evil, and where the people, the tribe, fits into that story. And those stories are very difficult to critique and change. Those are the ones. That's why I like to call those stories are not for compromise. Those stories have to somehow remain firm, or people lose the feeling of solidity that they want in their lives. And so I agree with you completely. Many conflicts can be resolved, but the way we talk about it is we say there's a contest between worldviews that is ongoing.
Absolutely.
That
Absolutely.
so far has not been resolved and will likely not be resolved. And that contestation of worldviews is what we focus on. In many cases, it really does affect the actual conflicts that are political and on the ground. Many cases it doesn't. We're not trying to reduce it all to one thing. But I wanted to make that distinction so you can see we really agree with you in many respects for everything you're doing. But there is this other aspect that we deal in that is profound, and it won't change in 30 years, right? There usually views of it might change. But having said that, I must ask you this question. In doing this book, your last book, did you come up with any data that you can share with our audience on what changed in 30 years in Israel to take it from a point in 1990 where the majority of the people were thinking that it was possible to have some kind of a friendly relationship with the Palestinians to where it is today. What changed?
Wow, okay. So now, just on this question, we can spend, half a day. But okay, I will put the focus on two processes which are related to what you just said. A little bit I would start, because in every religion, there are parts that can be pro-peace and, talk about empathy towards other in Jewish religion, in Islam, in Christianity, with all the differences. So, so the question is, how does it happen that a particular sector within the religion takes over, as it does happen, or did happen in Israel, so the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Zionists took over the monopoly of religion. Because, for example, remember Heschel, the one that was obviously marching with Martin Luther King, and he had completely different view of what is Judaism. And even in Israel, within the Orthodox system, we had rabbis like Rabbi Lichtenstein, Amital, that had very different view from the establishment. And I just give you an interesting anecdote. When I was teaching one day, a student came to me. She was a Muslim, and she said, "Can I write for you a work how Islam is propagating peace?" And she wrote a view really based on, obviously, writings of Muhammad, Quran, etc., making her point how the religion is really supporting peacemaking, conflict resolution, etc., etc. I read the paper. I don't know Quran, didn't know what to do. It was very convincing. So I went to a friend, colleague, who is expert on Quran, and showed him the work, the paper. And I asked, what do you say? And he said to me, it's a very nice work, selecting the particular verses that really support what you wanted to say. But I can give you another 100 that will support the opposite view. So this is a lesson that I learned, that you can bring all, and even in Jewish religion, in my present book, I brought all kind of verses from Talmud and Mishnah, where the support is for being compassionate, for being empathic to the other, etc., etc. But now going to the story, our story, I believe in order to focus on there are two problems. One I already noted, that the religion is in Israel very hawkish. And the more religious you were, this is the best predictor for your political orientation. If the more religious you are, the more hawkish you are. And this is correlation goes to 0.7, absolutely very high, and it is the best predictor of your view. This happened because of two important developments. One, demographic. So the ultra-Orthodox have 11 children, 8 children, etc., where secular Jews have 2, 3, maximum 4. And what happens, the ultra-Orthodox, the ones that I assume you know, were for many decades out of internal and external politics. They had one interest, the benefits for their community. But in the 80s, late 80s, they started to move to earthly politics. And they moved into really hawkish views, which were to some extent strange in the community, but they became, and today, 2021, they are part of the hawkish coalition in Israel. So, we are in big crisis, had 4 elections, but they stand with Netanyahu really ad hoc. They don't move from there, supporting the hawkish view of Netanyahu, whereas in 70s, 80s, they were working with Labour Party. So it's a big change. In fact, in the coalition of Rabin, he had one of the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox fraction of this sector. It changed dramatically. But the most important factor is what I differentiate between major events and the framing of major events, which means that the citizens of the state do not have an access to events. How did they happen, right? They don't know. Someone has to tell them what is going on, who is responsible, how did it happen. And the story is that our leaders framed the failure of Camp David meeting with Clinton in 2000 and the outbreak of the rebellion, Intifada, in 2000 and the disengagement in 2005 from Gaza Strip in completely different way. How did they happen? In making it short, Ehud Barak, who was in Camp David, in Arafat, came out and said, now I can say that I was searching for peace in every corner, and I found that Palestinians cannot be trusted because they want to annihilate Israeli Jews. And this was a message that if you will come and talk with this average Israeli, they will repeat the story. It's not true. It's not true. And then came the second event when the Intifada started in September 2000. Again, he said, this is an indication. It was instigated, fueled by Arafat, and he wanted violence and to achieve independence through violence. It's not true. So and again, you will ask average Israeli, he will repeat the story. And it was so convincing because Ehud Barak was a leader of the peace camp. So when the leader of the peace camp comes with such a message, it is accepted as a very valid and reliable. But, people, we know that leaders sometimes mismanage, lie, etc., for various reasons that it's even difficult to understand. So this particular events started to turn away people from dovish camp and center camp from their opinion into hawkish opinions. And in 2000, 2002, 2004 was really critical period, which I studied. I saw it against my eyes, how the movement goes on. And today we have the result. So as I told you, 70% of the Israeli Jewish population are hawks. About 15% will be doves, and the rest will be center.
You, John, I don't want to.
Oh, you're fine, Randy.
Danny, how does an Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jew talk to himself or herself in the story they have about being hawkish? What are the religious reasons they have for being hawkish?
The basic story, you see, the basic story that ultra-Orthodox Haredim, as we call them, had for years, that, which comes from diaspora, that we do not want to, how would I say, to anger the goyim, to anger the non-Jews. This was, it came from exile, and this was one of the way of survival, that we have our communities, but we don't want to fight with the state, Poland, Russia, France, United States, etc. They came to Israel with the same idea. And what I am telling you is on the basis, not only research, but personal talks that I had in the 80s. This was the slogan. But eventually what did happen, the idea of Eretz Israel belonging only to Jews penetrated deep into the these sectors. And even with time, just 1 second, and even in the, let's say, beginning of 2000, there was a kind of disagreement between the chief rabbis, who were the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox community, and the people, who really started to move through being influenced by press, through internet that slowly penetrated, and television that started to penetrate messages, and there was a gap. And the rabbis at the top understood that in order to be leaders, they have to be also followers of their camp. They cannot go here and they will go there. And the rabbis today are very hawkish, very hawkish. And also you have to understand, which is very important, that when we talk about Orthodox community, is very heterogeneous. So you have ultra-Orthodox and you have Zionist Orthodox. Those are the settlers that brought the ideology of whole Israel. And they were the ones that already in 1970, end of 60s even, began settling the West Bank. And they were really if you want, the pioneers that moved the nation into this direction. It all started with several dozens, and today we have 465,000 settlers in the West Bank and about 200,000 settlers in East Jerusalem. And the situation is as such that I cannot imagine that a leader, as it happened in Algiers, that, remember what happened there, that de Gaulle left them and they started to return back to France. He didn't want to give them any protection. But in Israel, I cannot see any leader at the moment that will give the order of withdrawing from the West Bank as it happens now.
If you are enjoying this podcast, please consider becoming a part by sharing on social media, clicking like, and visiting our patrons page and website donation page. You can find the links on the program notes and YouTube comments. Thank you for your partnership. Now back to the program.
The complexities of Orthodox Judaism, especially in Israel, there is a rumor, at least among Christians, that Orthodox Zionists actually see Israel expanding all the way to the Euphrates In other words, the idea of Israel is not just a political place, but it's all of the Levant. You know, is that the map, that the future map that's in the minds of many Jews, Zionist Jews? Is that a fact, or is that just a rumor?
You know, it's not only a vision of Zionist Orthodox, but this was a vision of a revisionist party, Jabotinsky, before 48, you know, of having what we called two banks, the Eastern and the Western Bank, which means that they view Jordan as a kind of belonging to the Jewish nation, because remember that on the Eastern Bank, there were two tribes, Ephraim and Menashe. So it's part of the land promised by God. But with time, obviously, Jews kind of compromised in order to get what they wanted. But remember one thing, Jews never established an international border. The green line was a ceasefire line of 1949, which was negotiated in Rhodos. So the leaders always thought that maybe there will be an opportunity to extend Israel. And the opportunity came in 1967. So from this time, when Israel won really decisively what we call Six-Day War, you know, it was clear that Israel will never relinquish the control over at least parts of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley and Eastern Jerusalem. But with time, the appetite rose, and the governments, which were mostly from the right wing, supported this idea until we came to the idea in summer that, you know, almost there was annexation, formal annexation, which was approved by Trump, and only what we call the peacemaking with Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco stopped the intention of, because this was the deal that you get full relationship instead of annexation. But it was on the table, beginning formal annexation. But we have to understand that there is informal annexation, because Palestinians are kicked out from the land continuously, and Israel builds continuously settlements, and, you know, so it's informally, it is annexed. And just, you know, a week ago, the Human Rights Watch said formally that Israel is apartheid, because you cannot look differently where half of the population have rights, Jews, and half of the population has not rights, between the river and the sea.
To be just to get a little bit more precise, is there a religious vision of a significant number of Israelis that if Israel could, it would expand much more into Jordan and beyond? That is the divine right, if you will, of
minority. It's minority. Very minority. At the moment, the struggle is over the West Bank, and mostly less about Gaza, because Gaza is not considered part of the Holy Land. You know, Philistines were there.
Okay, thank you. John, thank you for allowing me to. I have deposed our visitor. You now may have your.
No, you're just fine, Randy. I've enjoyed listening to the conversation. Danny, you mentioned the percentages, the number of hawks versus the doves amongst the Israeli population. In America, you've tended to have conservative Christians who've been very strong, very hawkish, very strongly supportive of Israel, but there's been something of a demographic shift towards younger Christians that are having more concern for the rights of Palestinians. How does that compare to what's going on in Israel? Are you starting to see a demographic shift, or are younger Israelis still hawkish?
On the contrary, John, what I see, we all see, is really that, I just completed a very big study among Palestinians about Jews financed by the European Union. And we find that on every indicator or every indice, the younger Jews are more hawkish than older Jews. So this is the direction. They become more religious, more hawkish as a community. Now you will ask why. One of the reasons, as we noted before, is the education system. People are born, individuals are born into particular reality. Giving you one example, in 1972, a minister decided, who was a minister coming from the Labour Party, from so-called leftist party, decided to erase the green line. So all the maps in Israel, all the maps are without green line. Now imagine a child where in his class, her class, there is a map, geographical map of Israel without green line, and the image that the child grows with is that this land is Jewish land. And I can tell you a small anecdote, because I don't give political socialization in the hands of the school or educational system, because I know how does it work and what is the influence. So I take personal responsibility to educate my children. And I have a daughter who is now 19 years old. And in the fourth grade, a teacher comes, it's a real story, with a map. And she says, the teacher says, this is state of Israel. And my daughter, who really is very smart and intelligent, raises her hand and says, no, teacher, no, this is not state of Israel. You may say that it's a Israel country, land, but it's not state because it doesn't have the green line. The teacher says to her, Galia, this is her name, you cannot be political in the class. Can you imagine? So this is a story. It is a small anecdote, but this explains what has happened. So children, as I already told you, I studied the young children in kindergarten. Then you have elementary school. People don't talk in home about, Eretz Israel, they don't. People talk about issues, other issues. Then you go to high school, and then you go to the army, where the army goes into West Bank, right, etc. So you come out of the system really hawkish. This is the story. And then the educational system, for example, forbids from various NGOs which are related to, let's say, watching human rights, etc., to enter the schools. There is a really instruction coming directly from the Minister of Education, so does not allow them to enter schools. Because why? Because he doesn't want, he's coming from the rightist party, he doesn't want that children will get alternative information about violation of human rights, about oppression, about possibilities of making peace. This is the story. So, if you follow how interesting is, let's say, in the Cyprus conflict, that the Turkish community and Greek community, I was there a number of times, decided to break the rule by the Minister of Education and prepare their own textbooks, which try to coordinate, synchronize the collective memory of Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. So it will be some kind of a basis for a possibility of reconciliation.
Yeah, I want to get one more question in, then Randy, I'm quite happy to turn it over to you for what time we have left. One of the things that's fascinating to me about your research is the significance of emotions in conflict. We've talked about narrative and framing, and connected to that is strong emotional attachment. So in the American context, we have this Christian nationalism, and conservative Christians grab onto that narrative and that framing and then attach great emotional investment, which then oftentimes results in negative perceptions of and relations with minority religious traditions. You talked about framing as it is going on in Israel there. In your book, Intractable Conflicts, you've got a chapter called Collective Emotional Orientations. Can you talk about some of the emotional connections to this process of these intractable conflicts?
Of course, the most important is fear, which when you talk about Jewish population, obviously it's related very much to Holocaust. And there's a slogan, so Holocaust can happen anytime. It is timeless. It is not related to particular group, because in the past, those were Greek, those were Persian, those were Egyptian, those were German, and now we have Palestinians and Arabs. So, and at the moment, as you know, Iranians, Netanyahu is obsessed with Iranians. And so there is all the time talk about possible war, which is very threatening experience. Wars are really very threatening by their nature. So you have fear, which is, we say that we are a nation with chronic trauma and chronic fear. And it's true, because we assess and we see fear is probably one of the most important factor in the psychological, if I will say, process that is going on with regard to the conflict. But you have also hatred that goes on. About 30% of Israeli Jews, in spite of the fact that declaring hatred is not acceptable in the current, let's say, societal discourse, still 30% declares that they hate Arabs, they hate Palestinians. You find very, often in Israel, death to Arabs, death to Arabs. And again, returning even in the school of my daughter, students were talking about death to Arabs, not understanding even the meaning. And teacher did not intervene, did not take action about such a saying. But you see slogans written on walls, death to Palestinian, which is hatred, anger, obviously you have a strong feeling. So emotion is very, very much connected to narratives that we call cognitive parts. And the cognition, as we call it, and the emotions are interrelated. Emotions obviously raise cognition, and cognition raise emotion. And you cannot talk separately, but they are very interwoven psychological reactions.
Randy, turn it over to you for our few remaining moments.
Thank you. Yeah, this should be a 2-hour session. Danny, I hope you'll come back and talk to us again, because this has been a very rich conversation. I feel like we are learning so much from you. It's so easy to presume from newspaper reports and even books that we are understanding what's going on in Israel and in the Palestinian situation. And I can tell from this conversation that the subtleties are really very important to grasp, and we don't have them here. But let me just end by a quick question. If you were to prompt Netanyahu to talk to a group of influential Palestinians, do you think he could ask this question, and then have a reciprocal question? What could we do to build trust with you? What would change your attitude of fear and even hatred? What could we do? And then if the Palestinians ask, what could we do in a practical way that would change Israelis' lack of trust for us, their fear of us, and their hatred for us? Just tell us, what could we actually do? What do you think the answers would be to those questions in terms of practical?
You wouldn't believe, I can send you a paper of my thesis, a master thesis of my student who studied trust. And she interviewed Palestinians and Jews and asked exactly this question about so you can see what they responded. But this question can be on a kind of ideological way. So someone will say, the Palestinian will say, stop the occupation. Stop the occupation, I would be able to trust you. Israeli will say, stop violence, and I will be able to trust you. But this is, obviously on such a level. In fact, following the studies that I just told you, that we completed to analyze 2 weeks ago, and I have unbelievable data, I found in this study that this trust is extremely deep. In other words, the best predictor of the distrust is the psychological repertoire of Jews, that they acquire it very early age. And just today, it's a it came about time. I had a talk with my ex-students, they are now professors, exactly about this issue. What we can do in order to what we can do in order to change the view. And one of the answers that I think personally, that we have to intervene in the educational system in very early age. We have to begin to change the views of the moment they grow up with in order to change. It is extremely difficult to change views of adults that, it's well entrenched. Giving you example, let's say, of my in-laws. He is a rightist, and he will say the following statements that he does. He says, I am ready for the withdrawal from the West Bank. I am even ready to give up East Jerusalem. And then comes the but. But, Arabs, they are violent inherently. I cannot trust them. It's all about. This is a story, right? This is a story. People have really very negative stereotyping, which is all the time imparted, propagated by the leaders. It is absolutely normative, institutionalized, that members of the parliament, Knesset, that the ministers talk in dehumanizing way and it is written in newspapers. It's heard about Palestinians. So when you have such a climate, it's very difficult to fight against it. Very difficult, very difficult.
Danny, do send John and me that paper on trust. I think that would be a very interesting piece of current social psychology that we'd like to know about. It would be helpful in our work.
I will send you two pieces, kind of. It's a book that John mentioned. So I will send you the final conceptual paper, and I will send you this particular chapter that is very interesting. You will hear what Israelis say about how we can build trust.
Well, unfortunately, gentlemen, we're coming close here to the close of an hour together. I echo what Randy said previously. It's been a rich conversation, and I hope we can do it again. I also hope we can keep in touch when we're not having podcast conversations. I don't know if there would be any cooperative possibilities between the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy and what you're doing there, but that would be wonderful. Randy, you want to share some of the things that you've done in the past in that region?
Again, I don't want to go too far on time, but I agree. Danny, I can tell you would be a fine interlocutor for some of the conversations that we're now having. We finally penetrated into Iran and are having very solid conversations based on theological and religious, ideological worldview issues that have deeply affected the politics in Iran. And we have not been able to find an Israeli to join in that conversation because they're too afraid, I think, of the current political situation. I actually had a friend who said he's worried about his job at a university if he actually just got into a conversation with an Iranian. So I don't know if you have the guts to go forward and try to do something like that. But I'd love to talk to you more about bringing you with your perspective of social psychology and actual history on the ground and sensitivity to religion into a conversation with some of our other parties that are trying to make a difference broadly in the Middle East, bringing that aspect into the conversation. So offline, you might tell us whether you're willing to do that.
I would be very happy. I mean, it's, I am, just in my country because again, the framing is unbelievable important for understanding. And the rightists succeeded in at least two arenas. One, they succeeded to erase the concept of occupation. It's not used. So when you talk with an Israeli, he will say occupation. It means that he is on the left side, what we call dovish side, immediately dovish side. The second one is to delegitimize the leftist or dovish people as being traitors and unloyal. So I really never gave up my views, published books, wrote articles, 25 books, never gave up and will never give up my freedom of thinking, my freedom of expression. So I am with you.
You understand very much the intra-religious diplomacy that must precede inter-religious diplomacy. The idea of being a traitor is so endemic to all of our religious tribes. And it's really hurting things in Iran now. It's very hard for anybody to say anything in Iran without being labeled a traitor, right? So you understand that. You're very empathetic with it.
I mean, if we have 3 minutes, John, I will tell a very nice story.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, okay. The very nice story is that in Israel, I don't know if you know, Condoleezza Rice assembled the heads of the religions in this region together, which means from the Christian side, but we have Catholics and we have Orthodox Greek, etc., then Muslim and Jews. And she assembled chief rabbis. She assembled them and brought them to Washington. And they started, to talk. And I participated, by the way, in some of their meetings in Jerusalem. But then they started to argue who is inciting more. So the Arabs said, Jews are inciting. Jews said, no, you are inciting. So Condoleezza Rice decided to carry a study, definitive study of analyzing Israeli and Palestinian textbooks. The job was given to Yale, and Yale got the money and recruited one Palestinian who built a team, and me, your friend, as being an Israeli who also built a team, and this is what we did. But Israel didn't want to collaborate and participate in the study. Eventually, we did the study, and what we found that really there is no strong dehumanization of by Palestinians or by Israeli textbook. No major difference, as Israelis always claim. So I was labeled as a traitor, unloyal Israeli, and the minister didn't want to approve the study. So Palestinians agreed, and they wanted to set a committee to really examine the textbooks, but the Israeli Minister of Education really did not want to cooperate with the Palestinian Minister but he blamed me for the results of the study as being an idiot and unloyal, etc., etc. So this is a story about interreligious, and it broke out. Eventually, the group that was meeting after Condoleezza Rice was not reconvened again.
Wow. we humans are so stupid sometimes.
Absolutely. It was a very nice remark.
It's enough to make me become a Calvinist to believe we're all depraved.
At least part of the time, maybe not total depravity, but well, I'm encouraged by the conversation and the contacts that we've made here and the possibilities. Gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll need to draw this episode to a close. I am John Moorhead. I'm the host of the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. My guests today have been Daniel Bar-Tal, coming from Israel, and Randall Paul, coming from our state of Utah here. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this rich and deep conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And if you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to share it with others on social media. You can like it on our YouTube page. And of course, you can give it a star rating on whatever podcast forum you happen to be using to listen to the podcast. And of course, we're a nonprofit organization at the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting our work. Again, John Moorhead for the Multi-Faith Matters podcast, thanking everyone for listening and for watching.